All right, so as I said before, we are going to talk about the Song of Songs today. I know most of you here have probably heard of this book of the Bible, and perhaps you've heard it called the Song of Solomon instead of the Song of Songs. So it's not entirely clear why Solomon's name is associated with this book and mentioned in it, but it probably has something to do with because of Solomon's tradition that he's known for, this wisdom tradition. But when we really look at the book and what's going on in there and what it's sharing about, it seems unlikely that he would have written it directly himself. So anyways, I really love to refer to this book, though, as the Song of Songs. So there's this really cool thing that the Hebrew does when it wants to say something's the best. So the Song of Songs, the song of all songs, it's the best song. The Holy of Holies, it's the most holy, King of Kings, etc. We see this happen a lot when it wants to really emphasize that, like, this is the one of all the things. So I think the Song of Songs is cool here as we try to understand what it's doing and what's happening in this book. So for those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with the Song of Songs, who just maybe haven't looked at it in a while, it's a poetic narrative of sorts. It's all about this young couple that's in love, and it is, interestingly enough, primarily written from the perspective of the woman as she shares, her feelings and her experiences towards this man that she is in love with and seemingly betrothed to. That's interesting because we don't often get to see the female perspective in a lot of the Bible. And when we do, it's usually through the lens of some sort of male figure. And there is, a good chance, seemingly, that this book could have actually been authored by a woman. And that's just a really cool thing when we think and we look at, why is this book in the Bible? What is it doing? What is God saying to us through this book? So this piece of love poetry in the Bible, not only is it written by a woman, but it's also unique in its style of literature. So we see a lot of poetry in the Bible that is definitely something that is noticeable. But when we do see poetry, it's often talking about God and referring to God, and people are reflecting on their relationships with God. And this one's a little more unique because it is talking about love, and not in the way that is so directly speaking about a relationship with God, but love between a man and a woman in a romantic relationship. And even though it's unique to the Bible, this style of literature about a man and woman who love each other, it's not necessarily unique to ancient Near Eastern literature around that time period. We see this, or this comes up, this sort of genre of romantic poetry during that time. So it's interesting to think about that as this maybe more secular style is integrated into the Bible for whatever reason. Typically this genre that's found all over the ancient Near East, it's reflected upon, or it's sort of often giving the hint that love is a good thing, that it is a divine gift in whatever form, for that person who wrote it. It is something that has been given, and it is something that is meant to be cherished and to be enjoyed, and to partake in. So that's something that's very special as we go and we realize what this means for the Bible and the way that we read this book. So let me get my Bible here really quick. So for those of you, again, who maybe have not read this book, or it's been a while, it's a book of poetry. Sorry, one second. There we go. So for those, again, who aren't super familiar with this book or haven't read it in a while, it's a book of poetry. Maybe just keep that in mind as we read. It's not the typical sort of narrative, or it's not breaking down theology necessarily. We're just gonna or I'm gonna go ahead and read a chapter of this book to you, chapter 6 of Song of Songs, just to sort of give us a snapshot of what's going on here. I would love to read the whole thing, but we don't have time for that. And I really encourage you in your own time to read the whole thing, because it's not super long, and I think it's best read in its entirety. But I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 6 for you before we keep talking about it. So there are these brackets in my Bible. I'm reading from the CEB right now that say who is the voice in this specific part, who's speaking. So I'll go ahead and I'll just put those in as we go through this. So, daughters of Jerusalem, which way did your lover go? You who are the most beautiful woman, which way did your lover turn, that we may look for him along with you? Woman speaking, my lover has gone down to his garden, to the fragrant plantings, to graze in the gardens, to gather the lilies. I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me, the one grazing among the lilies. An overwhelming sight. Man speaking, you are as beautiful, my dearest, as Tirzah, as lovely as Jerusalem, formidable as those lofty sights. Turn your eyes away from me, they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats as they stream down from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes as they come up from the washing pool, all of them perfectly matched, not one of them lacks its twin. Like a slice of pomegranate is the curve of your face behind the veil of your hair. There may be 60 queens and 80 secondary wives, young women beyond counting, but my dove, my perfect one, is one of a kind. To her mother she's the only one, radiant to the one who bore her. Young women see her and declare her fortunate, and queens and secondary wives praise her. Who is this gazing down like the morning star, beautiful as the moon, radiant as the sun, formidable as those lofty sights? To the nut grove I went to look upon the fresh growth in the valley, to see that whether the vine was in flower, whether the pomegranates had bloomed. I hardly knew myself. She had set me in an official's chariot. Come back, Shulamite, come back, so we may admire you. How you all admire the Shulamite as she whirls between two circles of dancers. Okay, so that's a sort of a snapshot into the language that's happening in this book. And again, I really encourage you all to go and read it for yourselves. And I'm going to tell you why in a little bit. But it's a lot more helpful to grasp what's going on if you read through the whole thing. And it's not hard to follow. It's definitely poetic literature, and it's coming back to the same sort of scene of a man and a woman chasing each other and loving each other over and over. So yeah, I encourage you to read that on your own time after we talk here today. So again, this book is really beautiful, and it's full of tension between these lovers. They want to be together, but for every reason, they keep losing each other, and they finally eventually make it back together. And then it seems like right when things are getting good, they lose each other. Imagine we're watching a romantic film of sorts, and you're really rooting for them and you want them to be together, and it's hard because they keep getting separated. The words that we read, they're almost shared like a dance, like the language they use. It's like they're right close together, and then they're going apart and coming back together. So I can describe it here to you all day, but it doesn't do it justice if you were going to go and read through it. It's also, like, maybe you noticed there is some strange imagery in there, saying that your hair is like a flock of goats, or your teeth are like a ewe, and it's it's very interesting imagery, but for whatever reason, the author of this book found it to be meaningful and helpful in describing the way, the beauty people see as they look upon their lover. So that's something that you might notice as you go through it. So now, after reading that, kind of getting our bearings a little bit, you might ask yourself, why is this in the Bible? So that's been a question that hasn't been super clearly answered for a lot of people who are trying to understand this book. There are some Jewish traditions that they, take this book very symbolically, as in, it is about God, who loves Israel, and Israel who loves God, and the man and the woman, they represent those relationships. Similarly, there are some Christian traditions that would go ahead and say that, this is the church and Jesus, and this is the relationship, the love that's there in one way or another. And like I mentioned before, we also have this tradition or this literature style that is somewhat secular and is bouncing around in the ancient Near East, and that, if we take that route, perhaps this is just a love story that made its way into the Bible, and we take it at face value in a way. And again, there are infinite ways to go ahead and interpret this and gain meaning from it. This idea of But I do want to take a look at this idea of just letting this book be what it is. And sort of in that way of like, this is a love story, but also allowing it to take on other meaning for what it means to be a person who lives in light of God and God's good world. Like, not only can we value this as a relationship and understanding that sort of romantic part of it, but what does that then mean for us as we move forward as people of God? So I kind of want to look at it in that lens, if that's okay with everybody here. I want to make sense of it and find that deeper meaning, and maybe a more clear sort of metaphor we can turn to. And how we do this, or the way I want to try and do this with all of you here, is to try and look at this book as a piece of art. And maybe this is familiar for some of you here. I think it might be, but not for everybody. And in being that piece of art that we observe this piece, and we allow ourselves to reflect on it, to interpret it, but not just in such a tight academic way, I guess, but to be open to different ways that God might be speaking to us in this work, and allow some of our own experiences to be a part of that. And we do this with other parts of the Bible sometimes, but with this book, I think it's something very interesting, because this book actually is one of the few books in the Bible that doesn't really mention God. God's name isn't brought up. There might be things that refer to God, or like maybe typically we associate with God, but God's not actually mentioned. So it's interesting in how we get to know God better through a book that doesn't really bring God up. And I think this artistic way of interpreting and reflecting might be helpful. So what I want to keep in mind, and again, this way of reflecting and learning about who God is, as we interpret through art, it can take you many different directions and in many different ways. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or you shouldn't do that, because I think you should. I definitely encourage anyone here to do that, to take, to reflect on the Bible or parts of the Bible as a piece of art, and to see where that leads you. But for the sake of, because we are doing this together here and I'm sharing about it, I want to keep it a little bit focused. I think firstly, I would like us to think back to when I said that this was a a book of Solomon, or it's often the title in the book is tied very closely to Solomon. And that's one of the reasons why that might be there, is because it's in the wisdom tradition. So in one way or another, this book is somehow guiding us towards wisdom or revealing wisdom. So I think that's a helpful guide as we go ahead and interpret and reflect on this book. How do we keep wisdom in mind as we go forward with it? We're not just trying to interpret for the sake of interpreting or taking something meaning away that like might be just useful and applies to everybody, but we want to figure out what it means to be wise as we go through this book. Secondly, I also want to challenge us, because there's a lot out there, and maybe if you've heard somebody share about Song of Solomon before, there's a lot out there about this metaphor of God and the church, or God and Israel, to understand this book. But I want to challenge us for just right here in this moment to not think about it in that metaphorical way, in that larger sense, to put that to the side, and let's see what it means if God is really telling us a story about a man and a woman who love each other in this way. What does that look like? What is that going to mean? And definitely this is not to say that this book can't be used for those metaphors of God in relationship with God's people, but I think it's always helpful to go and try new ways of understanding what it is God's doing in the Bible, and not stapling a how to understand the Bible to specific books and chapters so quickly, and just allowing ourselves to see what it means to understand this book without that. And I think that's also a part of these wisdom books, or this wisdom literature. Yes, they're helpful if we just read through them, and sure, we can take out maybe little formulas or equations we want to use for our lives as we go forward. But the reality is, when we read wisdom literature, so much of what we are reading has to be looked at through the lens of experience and understanding. You can learn from other people's mistakes, but sometimes you just can't. And there are ways of how we put our own experiences into this literature that we're reading, so that wisdom can actually and truly come into us and onto us. So I think that's something important just to keep note of as we go ahead and try and do this. So I think I have about 3 different ways. We'll see if we can get to them all. I know we're a little short on time here. But a few different ways of how we can, just examples for you guys as we reflect on this as art, because I think this is something that it's hard to do in this sort of context, and it might be best done by yourself, or maybe with your family or your friends, and people that know you well and share those experiences with you in an intimate way, and where you can really work those out together, or just by yourself, because this is a great book to reflect on personally, I think. So one of the first things I really notice in this book is the language, as we look at it as a piece of art. The freeness in the language of these two people that love each other. They don't really use words of embarrassment or shame when they're speaking about each other, but they freely go off for lines and lines about beauty and the attractiveness of their lover. They also freely express the willingness to pursue or to chase after the other one. It's this constant longing and searching and putting it into words, and I think that sounds great and wonderful, but the reality is, for a lot of us, when we have a crush on somebody, or we're interested in somebody, or even in a relationship with somebody, we don't want them to always know how much we want them or how much we love them. We try to play cool or be hard to get. And that freeness isn't always granted, especially if you come from you've been in a broken relationship, or a relationship that broke, or maybe if your family's love didn't look so free, and we don't, it's not so easy to always give ourselves and just freely tell people how much we love them or how great we think they are, because we're scared that they're going to think we're too much. And there's that fear of all that. So it's really cool to see here that it seems like there is none of that fear, and the love is always being reciprocated, and we're not encountering maybe the sort of rejection or lack of reciprocation that we've experienced in some of our relationships. Another way I think that as we reflect on Song of Solomon as a piece of art, if we're keeping this in the framework the framework of the Bible, what does this story remind us about? Like I said, we're not going to go into those bigger metaphors of God and God's people, even though that might be helpful. But what does this story remind us of that we would find in Song of Solomon? For instance, when we read the Psalms or Lamentations, there are context to those. They're not just random poems thrown in the Bible. They came out of specific events. Lamentations, it's poetry from the Israelites after they were exiled. Some of the Psalms are from David and his experiences. Miriam, Moses' sister, she wrote poetry or a song that was inspired out of the experience of leaving Egypt. And so what does this poetry remind us of, this poetic work? I think it sounds a lot like the Garden of Eden. There is clearly plenty of nature imagery and animal imagery. Maybe there's a hint that perhaps this is that same couple that we see in Genesis living in an untainted world. And I say that because we think back to this language that is expressing so much freeness in love, and there's this lack of pressure or baggage that maybe a lot of us, we feel we have in our own relationships, or that we bring when we enter into relationships. It seems like they just don't have that baggage here. They don't have that fear of being rejected or of being loving too much too soon. And it really reminds me, and there's a lot of theology and literature to this too, of that this could be that garden relationship before everything, became broken and sin entered the world and damaged relationships, and these expectations that can be so harmful to put on other people or ourselves. And it's really cool because this poem, it's inviting us to ask ourselves how we would truly love if we were free to give and to receive, and to love as if we did not have all these fears of brokenness that the world has given us after, our own experiences trying to love in this world. It's a really cool idea to reflect on that. That could be that Garden of Eden scenario with Adam and Eve. And it just might help us to understand how we navigate, love, and what it looks like if we were try and practice such a perfect and free love now. And lastly, so I want to leave you guys with this. So maybe, as you can see, reflecting on this book as a piece of art rather than a nonfiction story or a theological document, it can really open the ways in which we seek wisdom. And it's hard. I know I'm speaking a little vaguely and generally, but it's hard because I'm not you and I don't have your experiences. I have different ones. And the cool thing about doing this is that our experiences, they're going to grow, and our perspectives, and therefore the ways that we reflect art, it will too. One of the most helpful ways to reflect and draw out wisdom is to do it repeatedly. Read this book repeatedly. Bring your new experiences to this literature over and over again. When it comes to this idea of wisdom, it's so hard to simply write down wisdom and then follow it. Wisdom is best discovered and explored and learned through that lens of experience, of our own and of others. So I want to encourage all of you here, all of us here, to go through and to read this book and allow our experiences to permeate this reading as we seek to draw wisdom from these pages of Scripture.